Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Joe. How's life treating you?
Not bad. How about yourself?
We had a little bit of the wildfires, a little bit of smoke last week, but it was nothing like last summer. So my fingers are crossed that we have already seen the worst of it. And this year we will not be feeling like we need to wear gas masks when we walk outside.
Yeah, my fingers are also crossed for you. You know, maybe 3 weeks ago or so, we got some haze on the East Coast that was, of course, attributed to the wildfires out in California. So just scary to think that the sky would be turned orange over here on the East Coast because of things that are happening 3,000 miles away.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a mini ice age in Europe in, I think, 1400, 1500, somewhere around there, that was caused by a volcano erupting on the other side of the world. So at the end, it's a small world, and we are bound together by our natural disasters.
Yes. And maybe a mini ice age would not be a bad idea right now, so come to think of it.
Yeah, cool things off.
All right, well, let's get to this week's question. At the end of our last episode, I kind of teased this a little, that I was thinking during the Derek Chauvin trial about what would happen if the jury acquitted Chauvin. And it's not like that kind of thing hasn't happened before, because there was a jury only 30 years ago that acquitted 4 white police officers who beat the crap out of a black motorist named Rodney King. All 4 of them got acquitted. And though I was happy that the Chauvin jury reached a verdict of guilty, I did continue to wonder, about the phenomenon of juries kind of ignoring the evidence of their eyes and ignoring the law and returning verdicts of not guilty for people who were clearly guilty. So that got me onto the larger subject of jury nullification, which is something I've wondered about for years. So I asked you to look into that. What is jury nullification? How often does it happen? And really, does it apply to this kind of situation in a Chauvin verdict or Rodney King or OJ? Is jury nullification the right way to think about, the right term to use for that kind of situation? So what did you learn?
Well, as you might recall, I said when you first asked the question that I had no idea what it was.
Yes.
I'd never heard the term before. And it turns out that I did, in fact, know what jury nullification is, but I just didn't know the word for it. Jury nullification is when a jury returns a not guilty verdict, even though jurors believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant has broken the law. And technically speaking, jury nullification could also result in a guilty verdict as well as not guilty. But in practical terms, we're almost always talking about acquittal. And this may be by unanimous consent of the jury, or in some cases it's because just 1 or maybe 2 jurors triggered a hung jury by holding fast to a not guilty verdict while the rest of the jury is voting to convict.
Which is kind of de facto jury nullification.
Right, yes. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about nullification, it's not the law that's getting nullified. A jury's ruling in a particular case leaves that law on the books. What's getting nullified is simply that one case against a particular defendant.
Because convictions can be overturned by a judge or on appeal, whereas because of the concept of double jeopardy, you can't be tried twice for the same crime. So if you're not guilty, that can't be undone.
Right. And generally this happens because 1 or more of the jurors believes that the defendant has been charged either with an unjust crime or that the punishment for that crime does not match the severity of the crime. The history of juries doing this sort of thing is nearly as old as juries themselves. In England, trial by jury was part of the legal landscape going all the way back to the Norman Conquest or earlier, and it operated along such things as trial by combat or trial by ordeal. Joe, do you know what a trial by ordeal is?
I don't, unless it means having to watch court TV.
No, not that sort of ordeal.
Okay.
This sort of system was based on the premise that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer for an unjust accusation against him or her. So, for instance, a defendant would be required to immerse his hand into boiling water all the way up to the elbow. And if he was burned, then he's guilty. If he's innocent, God will save him miraculously. In a similar scenario in the witch trials, an accused witch would be bound by hands and foot and thrown into a river or a lake. A guilty witch would be rejected by the water and would float, whereas an innocent woman would unfortunately go to the bottom of the water and probably drown. So usually trial by ordeal was a bad scenario no matter what.
Yes.
Even if you were deemed not guilty, you suffered something terrible in the process.
Yeah, now I knew about the witch situation because of the How Do You Know It's a Witch sketch from Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yes, because she's lighter than a duck.
Right.
Now, eventually the Pope declared trial by ordeal to be contrary to Christian teachings, and so that was no longer accessible, and trial by jury became more common, but it wasn't formally established as a right until the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. And the Magna Carta was an attempt by English barons to rein in King John, who you might know as one of the bad guys from the story of Robin Hood. Modern historians think that King John was a fairly capable administrator, but he was not a popular monarch. He liked to say that the law was, quote, in his mouth. That is to say, the law was whatever he said it was. And there was a political theory in the air at the time, which was already centuries old, that the king is God's emissary on earth. Just as the Pope was said to be infallible in religious matters because he acted on God's behalf, so, the theory went, whatever the king said or did came with God's official seal of approval because the king was foreordained by God to rule and he was only responsible to God for his actions. This was the so-called, quote, divine right of kings, unquote. The Magna Carta was an attempt by the English barons to say, in effect, screw that. Just because your father was the king and you inherited the throne doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. You have to rule in accordance with the law. And one instrument of that was the defendant's right to a trial by jury. Because if the crown brought someone up on bogus charges or established a law that was unjust, the defendant could appeal to a jury of his peers to protect him against that sort of abuse. King John signed the Magna Carta, but he pretty much ignored it. And the idea of trial by jury took centuries to really take root. Over the next 400 years, various monarchs and their appointed judges found a variety of ways to harass and bully juries into delivering the verdicts that they wanted. One good example came in 1670, the trial of William Penn and William Meade. They were charged with unlawful assembly because they had delivered a sermon. It was illegal at this time to hold religious services for more than 5 people, except within the Church of England, and Penn and Meade were Quakers. It was never really in question whether the defendants were guilty of the crime they were charged with. They had held a sermon for an audience of 300 people, and it was out in the streets. There were plenty of witnesses to this happening. The only reason the sermon was out in the public, though, was the authorities had previously locked up their church. And the charges against them were punishable by death, so there was very good reason to wonder whether the punishment fit the crime. Quakers, after all, are famous for preaching nonviolence. So in this case, the court was threatening to put 2 of them to death for being excessively nonviolent. The defendants were harassed by the court throughout the trial. Penn was not allowed to read the charges against him before he entered a plea. They were forced to put on their hats in the courtroom and then immediately fined for wearing hats. And at various points, the defendants were bound and gagged for offering legal arguments that didn't suit the court. The 12-man jury initially voted 8-4 to convict, but the judges sent them back to deliberate again because they wanted a unanimous verdict. The jury would eventually return 5 additional verdicts, none of which were acceptable to the justices. They tried to rule that the defendants were guilty of some of the charges but not all of them, or that Penn was guilty but Meade was not, but the justices would accept nothing but guilty across the board. By the end of the proceedings, the jurors had been imprisoned without food or water for 3 days in an attempt to force a verdict out of them, but the court's attempts to intimidate them backfired, and every verdict they returned got closer and closer to not guilty. Finally, the charges were dismissed and the jurors were required to pay a stiff fine before they were allowed to leave. But one of the jurors, called Edward Bushell, refused to pay the fine, and from jail he petitioned to a higher court for relief. That court ruled in his favor, declaring that a jury could not be punished simply on account of the verdict it returned. This set an important legal precedent that protected juries from the sort of harassment they had suffered previously, and it was carried forward into American law. As for one of the defendants, William Penn, do you remember what he's famous for?
Yes, I was just going to jump in and say, is this the William Penn for whom Pennsylvania is named?
It is indeed, because 7 years later he would travel to America and found the colony of Pennsylvania as a place where Quakers could be free of the sort of thing he was subjected to back in England.
Very interesting. And good thing he wasn't convicted, right? Because we wouldn't want Pennsylvania named after a convicted criminal now, would we?
No, that would make it Australia. The decades leading up to the Revolutionary War had many examples of jury nullification, as you had an English government passing a series of laws designed to extract wealth from the colonies, and a population of colonists who were increasingly unhappy with their system of government. In 1735, for instance, a printer named John Peter Zenger was charged with seditious libel in New York because his shop had printed a newspaper that was critical of the royally appointed colonial governor. The author of the paper was anonymous, but the authorities prosecuted Zenger as an accomplice to the crime. The governor of New York at the time was very unpopular. Seemingly from the moment he arrived from England, he got busy extorting land and money from the locals, and so popular opinion was strongly against conviction. In the course of the trial, the court ruled that the jury was not responsible for deciding whether what Zenger had published was actually libelous. That was for the court to decide. And so their only role was to rule on whether or not Zenger was guilty of publishing the newspaper. Everyone agreed that Zenger was the publisher of the paper, so the court was pretty much holding him guilty by definition. Zenger's attorney, though, argued to the jury that they should issue the ruling not just on the facts of the case, but on the justice of punishing a man for doing what his client had done. And after only brief deliberation, they returned a not guilty verdict. As political sentiment in the colonies shifted to the view that England's political institutions were tyrannical, and their appointees instruments of that tyranny, it became more and more difficult to get a guilty verdict from a jury when a colonist was brought up for crimes against the crown. The authorities responded by transferring cases out of common law courts and into maritime courts, where the defendants had no right to a jury trial. This, of course, only made people even more angry and further enshrined in popular opinion the idea that trial by jury was an important safeguard against tyranny.
Now, this also seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that this is one kind of fundamental prerequisite to jury nullification is it's more likely to happen in a climate where many laws are considered unjust by like a critical mass of the population.
Right.
And that would obviously seep into the jury pool as well. So that seems like a prerequisite for jury nullification, right?
That is correct. And we'll see examples of that on the local level later in this episode.
Okay.
When the colonies won their independence and the power of the monarchy had been replaced by a presidency that some feared would sooner or later morph right back into a new monarchy, they created a system that enshrined trial by jury as a fundamental right. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton all wrote about how important it is that juries, in Adams' words, quote, find the verdict according to their own best understanding, judgment, and conscience, though in direct opposition to the direction of the court, unquote. Adams and his contemporaries had direct experience of a court system that treated them like ungrateful children, and they saw juries as an important way for citizens to resist a government that's no longer representing the will of the people. America is, after all, a nation founded by revolutionaries, for whom resistance to tyranny was a primary concern. That notion, though, lost its urgency over time. Later generations of American leaders took up institutional authority and became suspicious of anyone who fought against that sort of power. By the end of the 19th century, most judges were issuing rulings that were explicitly against the principle of jury nullification. In 1895, by a vote of 7-2, the Supreme Court voted to uphold the conviction in a case in which the trial judge refused the defense attorney's request to let the jury know of their nullification power. Even so, jury nullification raised its head at various important moments over the course of the 20th century. For instance, prohibition. Some have argued that one factor that sped up the repeal of prohibition was the fact that many juries seemed uninterested in convicting people charged with possession or sale of alcohol. And then there's a much more upsetting example. A number of Southern white juries refused to convict white defendants of violent crimes against black men.
Yeah.
To cite two notorious examples. In 1947, Willie Earl, a black man, was dragged from his jail cell, beaten, and shot to death in Greenville, South Carolina. 31 white men were charged with his murder, and even though the defense called no witnesses, a jury of 12 white men found them not guilty on all counts. And in 1951, Emmett Till, a black teenager, was accused of offending a white girl. He was kidnapped by the father of the girl, who with an accomplice beat him, shot him, and threw his body into a river. Despite the fact that there were witnesses to the crime, the all-white, all-male jury turned in a not guilty verdict. And 5 years later, the two defendants gave an interview to a magazine in which they admitted to the crime and expressed zero remorse.
Is that a case of jury nullification, or is that a different defect? Isn't the jury supposed to be composed of your peers and kind of represent the community? And if that's the case, then those all-white juries for Emmett Till was not a jury of one's peers and didn't accurately represent the community. So that seems to me like a different problem than jury nullification. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Certainly, Southern white juries did not represent the cross-section of ethnicities that community actually had. There were people who were just excluded from the legal system and victimized by that exclusion.
Right. Jim Crow.
I think probably if we're going to point the finger of blame in these two cases, it would be at the prosecutor for allowing a jury of basically racist white men to acquit racist white male defendants. The prosecutor should have made some effort to provide a diversity of viewpoint on those juries.
Right.
But I would still say that this does count as nullification because it was hard to imagine that the jury did not know that the defendants were guilty of the charges against them, and still they chose to acquit.
Yes, and from your definition at the top, if they know the law and they know the law has been broken and they still acquit, then that by definition is jury nullification.
Right. Now, on a much less important and dramatic level, I saw an example of jury nullification the last time I showed up for jury duty. One of my fellow citizens, a young white man, told the judge before the jury selection that he would refuse to convict a black man, no matter the weight of evidence, because of his conviction that there were already too many black men in prison. And on that day, I confess that I was feeling pretty cynical. I believed he was saying that because he knew it would get him out of jury duty. And if so, his strategy worked. After a scolding by the judge, he was sent home. Meanwhile, the defendant was left to stand trial before a jury of people who did not share that man's convictions, or at least didn't say them out loud. And I, in fact, was on that jury.
Yes, and just thinking aloud here, if he truly wanted to affect that verdict, the best thing to do would be to shut up and not say anything to the judge about that, get selected for that jury, and then express his opinion in the deliberation.
Exactly. Or even more strongly, refuse to ever vote to convict so that it results in a hung jury and a mistrial.
Right, right.
So ultimately, jury nullification is not a good versus bad story. Wherever you stand on the political spectrum, there will be some examples of nullification that you celebrate and others that you cannot stand. Estimates are that nullification happens in 3 to 4% of all jury trials. That would be very difficult to get a truly accurate count since jurors don't need to explain the verdicts they reach. So it's undeniable that juries have the power to nullify, but whether they have the right to do so is a hotly contested question. In most states, defense attorneys are not allowed to instruct the jury on their power to pass judgment on the law as well as the facts of the case. The Supreme Court has let stand rulings by lower courts that a mistrial should be declared if such an argument has been presented to the jury. And on a few occasions, people who have distributed literature promoting awareness of jury nullification have been charged with jury tampering and obstruction of justice. though in most cases the charges were later dismissed or they were acquitted. In 2016, New Hampshire passed a law requiring juries to be informed of their power to nullify, but so far no other states have followed suit. One thing we can say for sure, jury nullification isn't going anywhere. To prevent it, we'd have to tear the Constitution up by its roots. One or more of the following would need to go: trial by jury, the double jeopardy clause, or protections that keep a jury from being punished or intimidated. All of those are cherished American institutions, so that's not going to happen. The only real question is whether it's in the public interest to promote awareness of nullification so that more juries will feel empowered to rule on the justice of the law and not simply the facts of the case. And jury nullification draws support from people who, because of experience or temperament, are focused on the ways in which the government and institutions can be oppressive. First off are libertarians. These are the big nullification fans. They're out there wearing nullification t-shirts and waving giant novelty foam fingers printed with the phrase, "Jury nullification number 1." Not really, but you get the point. While preparing for this podcast, I was reading a book on nullification, and I thought to myself, wow, this guy really loves jury nullification. And then I checked the publisher, and it was the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank.
Yeah.
Jury nullification is perfectly aligned with the basic premise of libertarianism, which is that institutional authority of any kind is a restraint on liberty and pretty much always a bad thing. So yeah, if you find yourself talking to someone who's a big fan of nullification, there's a good chance that he's a libertarian. But they're not the only ones. There are opponents of mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines who believe that the mandatory punishment for crimes in this country often doesn't match the severity of the crime and support juries in returning not guilty verdicts if defendants would be sent away for no good reason. Black rights activists also sometimes advocate for jury nullification on the grounds that there's plenty of systemic racism in the legal system, and nullification is one good way for the community to resist.
Right.
Drug legalization activists also support nullification as a way to keep from sending people to prison for nonviolent drug crimes. And prison abolitionists would support it on the grounds that sending anyone into our nation's prison industrial complex almost always has bad outcomes.
Yeah. We are now in an era where there are a lot of unpopular laws. The ones you mentioned, drug possession laws, 3 strikes you're out for commission of felonies, maybe assisted suicide, any laws against that. And I'm even thinking things like protesting wars, maybe otherwise innocent pacifist war protesters. These seem ripe for jury nullification because I think there's a large number of people who just think those are unjust laws and could protest them via their jury vote.
Yeah, you're right. If you think about it, there's basically 2 things that we can do as citizens if we feel that the laws are not just. And the first is to elect a representative who's going to change the laws. And the second is to resist those laws in some effect. And jury nullification is a kind of a nice way to do that because there's not many situations in which you can resist a law and be protected by the law in doing so. Like it's this perfect little pocket within the legal system where resistance is tolerated, if not actively encouraged.
Right.
And ultimately the question does come down to that philosophical question. Where do you want power ultimately to reside? In a common system of laws or in local communities? If the former, then jury nullification seems like an aberration, and the solution to bad laws is to elect representatives who will make better laws. If the latter, and if you believe that wherever there is power there will inevitably be oppression, jury nullification is a necessary check on institutional power. Where do you stand on the issue, Joe?
I think I want jury nullification to exist, but I fear it being invoked in a case where I would rather it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So this brings me back to my original question. Like, in light of your reading, do you think the OJ verdict is a case of jury nullification? Had the jury acquitted Chauvin, would that be a case of jury nullification? What do you think?
I'm not convinced with the OJ thing. I think OJ got off because the prosecutors in that case were just not very effective at that, and the police had done a very poor job of collecting evidence. So I feel like one or more jurors on that could have had a good faith belief that the prosecution simply had not made the case.
Right.
I think a better example is, like the Rodney King example you mentioned, or possibly the Derek Chauvin thing, where there's video evidence of a crime being committed, and yet a jury returns a not guilty verdict. And in that case, yes. And I think it is inevitably the case with jury nullification that there is going to be some bad with the good. There are going to be times when a jury steps up and prevents someone from being sentenced to many years of hard time because of his possession of a small amount of marijuana, and we're going to think, oh yeah, that good for them. And then there are going to be times when juries reflect the worst of humanity, and it's because this isn't a power that is granted to juries, and they're not instructed on how to do it properly. It's an exception to the rules. It's a little window of opportunity, and different jurors are going to use it differently. I do tend to think that nullification is a necessity, given the fact that over our history we've shown the ability to pass laws like the Fugitive Slave Law, which is a great example of nullification that I didn't mention. It was this absolutely appalling law that in free states in the North, if a slave managed to escape, it was incumbent on citizens of the free states to return him to his owner. And Northern juries would not convict on that because it was abhorrent. And every now and then we do have laws that are just not right. They were passed for the wrong reasons, in bad faith by bad actors, and it is not right to convict people on the basis. And in that case, if a guy's up on charges and he's guilty of the charges, but the charges themselves reflect an unjust law, then we need nullification as a last recourse.
Yes, and you add to what you said that there's also that critical mass of public opinion that's consolidated against the law, as did happen, at least in the North, prior to the Civil War, thus making the Fugitive Slave Law ripe for jury nullification.
I mean, if we wanted to think of this in the grand scheme of things, we can think of nullification as just one more part of the system of checks and balances. That we have various measures in our government and legal system to trip up someone who tries to overreach. And maybe we can think of nullification as just one more part of that, is that it's there in order to trip up the government when it overreaches. But it's not always going to be used properly. Every now and then there's something's going to happen and it's going to be injustice, and that's just part of the process. Yeah,
I guess my problem with the way jury nullification is handled and tolerated today is in the vagueness with which the concept is in Americans' minds in the first place. So there are times, as we just pointed out, like with the Fugitive Slave Law, where there's just such an instinctual sense on the part of Americans that the law is wrong, that it makes the jury nullification easy, right? But most of life is not so clear-cut. So it troubles me that judges are inclined not to even mention the possibility of jury nullification to the jury ahead of their deliberations, because most Americans are ignorant, don't even know who the vice president is. So how the heck are they going to know that this thing exists called jury nullification that they can employ to look askance at a bad law?
Right.
What we have, it seems to me, is a system, kind of this elaborate don't ask, don't tell scenario, right? Where the judge is not going to tell you that nullification exists, and you're not allowed to ask about it, evidenced by the guys who ran around outside the court flashing those signs and getting arrested for it. So you can't ask about it, you can't be told about it, you have to kind of intuit it when you're in the deliberation room and kind of reach this organic process of figuring out, hey, we can do this, people. We can just acquit this person even though they're technically guilty. Like, it seems to me juries have to kind of come to that organically. And that's a hard thing to come to when you don't know the law and you don't understand how to apply it. All of that is to say that I wish there were some way to address jury nullification more directly in prepping a jury for its deliberations.
Yeah. I have some sympathy to that. I wonder, though, if jury nullification is a better thing if it is truly organic. If a juror is sitting in the jury box and has the thought, this isn't right, then maybe that's nullification in its purest form. Instead of us having grade school classes on nullification or a high school seminar on the topic, and people come in with the preconception of this is when I should apply jury nullification, instead of it just coming from their heart.
Right.
But I do tend to agree with you. The things that we don't talk about tend not to be the best functioning parts of our society.
Yeah. And yet your point is well taken. I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction with that. I was imagining a scenario where we're trying the insurrectionists for January 6th. And the video evidence is absolutely compelling, to a Derek Chauvin or Rodney King-like degree of clarity. And yet the judge tells the jury, now you could nullify this if you want to. And then there's one, or two Trump MAGA people on that jury. And there you go, a hung jury in that case,
right.
That could be the downside of alerting people that they have this right.
100%. Yeah. And it brings us back to the earlier question, like, where does your faith ultimately reside? Is it in the rule of law, in which case these people they broke the law. They trespassed. They tried to overthrow our system of government. They broke the law and they should be convicted. Or is it in the personal convictions of the people within the jury? And which of those two things do you have more faith in? I don't think that's an easy question to answer.
No.
I think that's a question that makes me uneasy on both sides of the scale. So I'm kind of like, I don't know.
Yeah, I want to say both. I want to think that there's a way to honor the rule of law and take the judge's instructions seriously while also knowing that in a case of extreme injustice, an unjust law, a law is unconscionable or unconscionably applied. It could be a perfectly decent law that's unconscionably applied by an ambitious prosecutor. And to have that kind of thing in your back pocket that we now know as jury nullification to be the final arbiter and the last resort if the rule of law is not serving you in that situation. That's kind of the way I'd like to think about this.
Yeah. It is, I think, a topic that intelligent people can disagree on.
Yes.
But did I answer your questions?
Yeah, you sure did. And this was really interesting. And I'm glad I asked the question because I enjoyed talking about it with you.
Cool. Okay, are you ready for next week's question?
Yep, lay it on me.
So this is something I've been wondering about for about 4 years, which is that when Donald Trump was elected, I felt kind of blindsided. But when I pull back a little bit, I can recognize that his election as a very conservative, populist president was part of a wave. Like, we've also seen Boris Johnson elected as prime minister in Great Britain, and a number of strikingly conservative leaders in Eastern Europe, while the far-right party in France and Germany is getting more votes than they ever have. And this brings to mind the period before World War II, when fascism emerged in Germany and Italy and Spain. So my big overarching question is, why do these things tend to happen at the same time? Like, what forces are driving them? A lot today gets blamed on social media. That feels like it's a little bit too simple to me, because if you don't have an audience that's receptive to the message, it doesn't matter how the message is delivered to them. So what are we looking at in terms of economics or politics or sociological factors that is making a populist message so widely accepted, not just in the U.S., but really on a global scale right now?
That's a fascinating question, and I look forward to researching it.
Okay, cool.
All right, folks. If you like this episode of Mansplaining, or you want to leave a comment about this episode or any other episode of our podcast, please go to our Facebook page. It's titled Mansplaining the Podcast. Very easy to find. We welcome your feedback, positive or negative. Please like us there if you enjoy these podcasts. And that's also incidentally where we post our sources for each episode. So for those of you who want to dig down deeper and understand why Mark said all those crazy things he just said today, that's another place to go. Mansplaining the Podcast on Facebook, and check out the sources. Sometimes we post interesting and funny videos if they're relevant to the topic, and maybe that Monty Python How Do You Tell a Witch video will be there if you're lucky, if you're good. Anything you want to add to that, Mark?
No, except that no one is ever going to understand the crazy things that I say, least of all me.
That's true. Yeah, that's right. And that's all for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you next time. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.